Have you ever wondered if the darkest hour is truly just a curtain waiting to be pulled back to reveal a blinding stage of light? Or if a mother's silent tear carries more weight than a tycoon's angry shout? Today we bring you a story of a resurrection so magnificent it defies logic. A moment where the muddy ruins of a destroyed wedding are suddenly paved with gold. In this breathtaking chapter, we witness the ultimate payoff for every tear Diep has shed and every insult Jame has swallowed. While Mr. Huyen sits in his cold tower believing he has crushed his son into the dirt, a mysterious convoy arrives at the edge of the forgotten village, carrying a royal dowry that could buy the entire province. Watch as the king returns to his throne not in a skyscraper, but on a rotting wooden porch, and witness the shock of a lifetime as poverty is washed away by a wave of imperial splendor. Stay with us to see how a mother's secret love turns a tragedy into a legend. The morning sun struggled to rise over the desolate yard, casting long, melancholic shadows over the debris of what was supposed to be a wedding feast. James stood amidst the broken wooden chairs and trampled flowers, his red velvet dye, now stained with the mud of yesterday's cruelty, still clinging to his frame like the armor of a defeated general. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, the kind that follows a storm that took everything but your life. He looked at Diep, who was quietly sweeping the porch, her movements slow and heavy, her eyes swollen from a night of silent weeping. A wave of intense, agonizing regret crashed over him, a soul-wrenching sorrow that he, a man who once moved mountains with a signature, could now only offer her a kingdom of dust and splinters. He clenched his fists, feeling the bitter sting of helplessness, whispering a silent apology to the wind for dragging the woman he worshipped into this abyss of humiliation. "I promised you the world, my Diep," he thought, his heart bleeding with a raw, throbbing pain. "And yet I have given you nothing but a war you didn't choose." But then, the earth beneath their feet began to tremble, not from an earthquake, but from the rhythmic, heavy march of a procession approaching from the village path. Jame looked up, his eyes narrowing in defensive instinct, expecting another wave of Mr. Huyen's henchmen coming to finish the job. But what emerged from the morning mist was not a squad of thugs, but a line of solemn strangers dressed in impeccable traditional silk, carrying large, intricately carved lacquer boxes draped in red and gold cloth. They moved with a respectful silence that felt almost holy, contrasting sharply with the gritty, muddy surroundings of the slum. Diep dropped her broom, her hands flying to cover her mouth in a stunned expression of utter disbelief, her breath catching in her throat as the procession filled their small, muddy yard with an aura of imperial majesty. These were not enemies. They were bearers of a dowry so luxurious, so sacred and noble, that it seemed to mock the very poverty that imprisoned them. As the strangers set the heavy boxes down on the creaking wooden porch, the leader bowed low to Jame, handing him a letter sealed with a familiar wax crest. A crest that belonged not to the corporation, but to the private lineage of his mother, Mrs. Huyen. Jame's hands trembled as he opened the letter, and as he read the words penned in his mother's elegant, tear-stained handwriting, a profound realization washed over him like a tidal wave. She had not abandoned them. She had been watching, waiting, and quietly moving assets worth hundreds of billions to ensure that her son's wedding would not be a funeral of dignity, but a coronation of love. Jame felt a touching and meaningful lump form in his throat, a mix of overwhelming gratitude and a fierce, renewed pride. He walked over to the first box and lifted the lid, revealing a blinding glare of gold, necklaces, bracelets, and ingots resting on red velvet, shining with a defiance that screamed against Mr. Huyen's tyranny. Jame turned to Diep, his face transformed from the mask of a weary exile to the radiant visage of a king reclaiming his power. He beckoned her closer, his voice trembling, not with sorrow, but with a joy so intense it felt like a rebirth. "Come here, my love," he whispered, the sound resonating with a deep, soulful authority. "Look at what the universe has returned to us." Diep stepped forward, her legs weak, her eyes wide with an overwhelming sense of wonder as she gazed upon the treasure that lay amidst the rotting wood. It wasn't just gold, it was vindication. It was a message from the heavens and from a mother that their love was worth more than all the suffering they had endured. Jame picked up a heavy, intricate gold necklace, its craftsmanship fit for a queen, and stood before her. In that moment, the rotting shack faded away, the mud disappeared, and all that remained was the golden light of their victory. He prepared to adorn her, not just with jewelry, but with the dignity she had never lost, promising that this was only the first step in reclaiming their world. The absolute silence of the muddy yard was broken only by the sharp, metallic clink of gold striking gold as Jame lifted the heavy necklace from its velvet cushion. It was a sound that echoed like a bell of liberation, announcing to the stunned villagers gathering at the fence that the era of humiliation was over. Jame stepped closer to Diep, treating the moment with the solemnity of a coronation. He looked into her eyes, which were swimming with tears of shocked disbelief, and saw the reflection of the woman who had stood by him when he had nothing but a needle and a scrap of cloth. The weight of the gold in his hands was substantial, a cold reminder of the 100 billion VND fortune his mother had secretly moved, but it felt light compared to the crushing weight of gratitude in his heart. "Diep," he whispered, his voice trembling with a touching and meaningful intensity. "This gold does not define your worth, it merely reflects the light you have always carried inside you." As he gently fastened the intricate golden clasp around her neck, a collective gasp swept through the crowd. The contrast was blindingly poetic, the vibrant, heavy gold resting against the simple fabric of her attire, shining brilliantly against the backdrop of the rotting wooden walls. Diep touched the cold metal, her fingers trembling as the reality sank in. She wasn't crying because she was rich. She was weeping because she was finally seen. For months, she had been the target of whispers and pity, but in this sun-drenched moment, with the weight of an empire around her neck, she felt a soul-wrenching vindication. The tears that fell onto the gold were not of sorrow, but of a joy so overwhelming and profound that it felt like her heart was breaking open to make room for it. Jame took a step back to admire her, and for the first time, the shadow of his father's tyranny did not darken his gaze. He saw only his queen, armored in the love of a mother he hadn't seen in years. He turned to face the direction of the city, towards the cold glass tower where Mr. Huyen sat, and felt a surge of fierce, white-hot determination. This wedding gift was not just a present, it was a war cry. He mentally drafted a vow to the universe, swearing that every ounce of this gold would be used to build a fortress around Diep. The philosophy of their love had shifted from resilience to conquest. They wouldn't just weather the storm, they would become the storm. Unknown to the couple, hidden behind the thick trunk of an ancient banyan tree at the edge of the village path, Mrs. Huyen watched the scene unfold with a handkerchief pressed to her mouth to stifle her sobs. She saw her son, who had left her as a boy of privilege, now standing as a man of honor, his spine stiffened by hardship and his heart softened by love. She saw Diep, the daughter-in-law she had never officially welcomed, wearing the family heirloom with a grace that no socialite in the city could ever match. The risk she had taken to smuggle this fortune out from under Mr. Huyen's nose was immense, a betrayal that could cost her everything. But seeing the radiant, sacred light on their faces made every second of fear worth it. She whispered a silent blessing, a mother's prayer carried on the wind, knowing that she had given them the sword and shield they needed to fight back. As she turned to leave, disappearing like a ghost into the shadows of the bamboo grove, she knew her part in this chapter was done. The rest of the story belonged to the king and queen of the impoverished village. Back on the porch, Jame took Diep's hands, now adorned with heavy gold bracelets that clinked softly with her every movement. He pulled her into an embrace that defied the stiffness of the jewelry, burying his face in her hair as the villagers finally erupted into cheers and applause. The sound was deafening, a symphony of support that drowned out the lingering echoes of their past struggles. Jame lifted his head, his eyes burning with a new, dangerous fire. "They wanted to see us broken, Diep," he said, his voice low and laced with a promise of retribution. "So let them see us shine so bright it burns their eyes." He looked at the muddy road ahead, no longer seeing a path of exile, but a red carpet paved with their own resilience. The wedding of the century hadn't happened in a five-star hotel. It had happened right here, where love was the only currency that mattered, and where a few crates of gold had turned a tragedy into a legend that would be told for generations.
Cha mình có thể phá hủy mọi vật chất, nhưng không thể chạm tới lời thề trong tim họ. Anh che chở Diệp, kiên quyết giữ vững phẩm giá giữa cơn bão hận thù. Từ tro tàn cô